Hello. We are going to now be speaking about the Lord's infancy in Bethlehem. In the nativity sets that we see, there are shepherds and the three kings, usually, right? But the truth of the matter is that they never met, because the shepherds were there first, and then the kings arrived 2 years later, when Mary and Joseph were not in the stable anymore. They were in a home, but yet they were still in Bethlehem for a couple years. There were no barns. Their arrival in Bethlehem were separated, as I said, by about 2 years. The Magi, okay, let's talk about the Magi. The Bible never states that there were three. In fact, it is only certain that there were at least two because of the word wise men, or plural. We do not know. There could have been 20 or more, and Dr. Fruchtenbaum said even 200. There were enough, though, to cause the whole city of Jerusalem to be tremendously stirred up with excitement. Matthew 2, chapter 2, verse 3 says that, and that implies that perhaps there were considerably more than just the mere three. The Bible never refers to them as kings either, but refers to them as magi, and in Hebrew, magoi, or wise men, a term that means astrologers. According to Holcroft, a Bible commentator, these Gentiles, and they were Gentiles, were expert in astrology and in the interpretation of dreams and other secret arts. Their studies included both astrology, astronomy, science, and superstition. The Greek term magoi is very likely a translation of the Hebrew Chachim, Chakkim. That also is in Hebrew, and it means wise men. Chachim occurs most frequently in the book of Daniel, where several types of wise men can be identified there. There were magicians, enchanters or astrologers. There were sorcerers, Chaldeans, and diviners or soothsayers. So these wise men came from the east, which in Scripture means the area of Mesopotamia. In this passage, an unknown number of Gentile astrologers from Babylon arrived in Jerusalem and asked, quote, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews?" Matthew 2, verse 2. As to the origin of the Magi, there are multiple suggestions, including Persia, Arabia, or Babylon. The Talmudic notion cited above favor Persia. Other Talmudic notions favor Arabia. However, from the wider biblical record, Babylon is in southern Iraq, and that is preferred as the localization most favored by the astrological implications of the rising of the star. After the Babylonian exile, a large group of Jews remained there, so that Babylonian astrologers could have learned something of the Jewish messianic expectations from them, and might have associated a particular star with the King of the Jews. Matthew states that at this point of time, the family was still in Bethlehem and had not yet returned to Nazareth. That's in Matthew 2, verse 1. How did these Gentile astrologers from Babylon know that a Jewish king had been born? And why would they have chosen to come and worship him? There had been astrologers in Babylon since at least the time of Nebuchadnezzar. And there had been many kings in Israel over a millennium. There were kings in Israel for over a millennium, yet there's no record of a Babylonian astrologer going to Jerusalem to worship a Jewish king until the birth of Jesus, that is. What's so different about this infant Jewish king? In antiquity, that a star would appear as a harbinger of a crucial point in history was not an unusual concept. But exactly what was this star? Many have tried to explain it astronomically, but all such explanations fail, since nothing celestial can do what this star could. The basic rule of interpreting Scripture is to take the Bible literally, unless there is something in the context that will not allow it to be taken that way. That's the golden rule. There are 5 things about this star in this context that show it is something other than a literal star. First, it is referred to by the possessive pronoun. We have seen his star in the east. It was the Messiah's personal star. It belonged to him in a way that was not true of any other star. Of course, all the stars are God's because he created them, but here was something unique about this one that made it the Messiah's personal star. Second, this star appeared and disappeared on at least 2 occasions, was suddenly vanished, and then it reappears. Third, it moved from east to west. Generally, that's how stars rise. From the east, move to the west. But it then moved from north to south in Matthew 2, verse 9. And fifth, it literally came down and hovered over one particular house in Jerusalem. In Bethlehem. In Bethlehem. So, and lo, quote, and lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. Stars, we know, are a mass of burning gases. Any literal star coming down to hover would have destroyed an entire planet. A commentator, Brown, notes, while the motif of a star leading people to a destination is known in antiquity, the precision of leading them to a house is unusual. If this was not a literal star, then what was it? Neither comets nor conglomerations of planets or constellations can do what this star could. The explanation lies in the word heavenly, referring to the spiritual, not the physical realm. In Greek, the root of the word star means, quote, radiance or brilliance. This brilliance is none other than the Shekinah glory. The wise men were the first to notice, quote, a new light in the heavens. This brilliance somehow signaled to them that the Messiah, the King of the Jews, was born. Jews would have known from the scriptures, but how did Gentile astrologers know that? There is a Babylonian connection in the book of Numbers. In the book of Numbers, in chapters 22 to 24, there is a record of God's dealing with Balaam. Balaam was a Gentile astrologer, a seer, who came from the region of Babylonia. Balaam declares a messianic prophecy. Well, Balaam had a considerable reputation. He was widely regarded that whomever Balaam cursed would be cursed, and whoever he blessed would be blessed. At this point in the exodus from Egypt, the Israelites had arrived in the border of Moab and were about to enter the promised land. The king of Moab took objection to the prospect of new neighbors and decided to take action. He commissioned Balaam for a considerable amount of money to curse the Jews. And 4 different times the king of Moab took the seer to a high mountain where he could look at the Jewish encampment. 4 different times Balaam tried to open his mouth to curse the Jews, and 4 different times God took over Balaam's mouth and causes him to bless the Jews. In these blessings, he issued several messianic prophecies, one of which is found in Numbers chapter 24, verse 17. Quote, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob. A scepter shall rise out of Israel and batter the brow of Moab and destroy all the sons of tumult. The word scepter here is a symbol of kingship. It was this Babylonian astrologer, Balaam, who connected the coming of the messianic person with kingship and with a star. Archaeologists have discovered that the Babylonians kept many historical records. Much of our knowledge of the Genesis to Exodus period comes from Babylonian sources. Archaeologists have also found an inscription containing a prophecy of Balaam, now housed at Jordan's Museum of Discoveries in Deir Allah, Jordan. And in 1967, they discovered an artifact with Balaam, son of Beor, mentioned. In rabbinic writings, Balaam's prophecy about the star was recognized to be messianic. Thus, the star, as a symbol of the Messiah, was a connection the Jews would have made. Just as God interacted with Balaam in the Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament, he made sure that these Babylonian astrologers would have knowledge of the star and its import. But Balaam's prophecy says nothing about when the star would appear. Therefore, how would they have known when to look for the star? Or how would they have known that when a star appeared in the heavens, it was the star that signaled the birth of the messianic king? Well, there is another definite connection. Of all the Old Testament prophecies of the first coming of the Messiah, only one passage pinpointed how many years would transpire before the Messiah would come, and that is Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27. This passage contains the messianic timetable of all time. Unlike many of the other books of the Old Testament, the book of Daniel was not written in Israel, but in Babylon. In fact, half of the book is not written in Hebrew, the Jewish tongue, but in Aramaic, the language of the Babylonians. Daniel and his 3 friends, young friends, were chosen to be instructed at the school of the Wisemen when they were deported to Babylon. Then a day came when Daniel was able to save the lives of all the Babylonian wise men. These astrologers were unable to interpret one of Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. It is remarkable that it was a Babylonian tablet that recorded Halley's Comet in 164 BC. No doubt, because of that experience, many of these astrologers turned away from the worship of the stars and, because of Daniel's influence, became believers in the God of Israel, Daniel's God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Why? Because Nebuchadnezzar appointed Daniel as the head of the Babylonian school of the wise men. However, Daniel never received his information and revelation from the stars, but from the creator of those stars, the God of Israel. Daniel never believed or practiced Babylonian astrology. Generations later, the Babylonians still had in their possession a book written by one of their former presidents, the Book of Daniel. And that book pinpointed how many years would transpire before the Messiah would appear. Therefore, they knew when to look. However, and we'll talk about that prophecy in the book of Daniel's and that part of it, the section that Daniel wrote, that from the beginning of an edict for the Israelites to go back to their land and rebuild the city and the temple in Jerusalem until the Messiah would be so many weeks, right? 70 weeks of sevens and all that. But that has been understood. We'll talk about that at some future point. However, though, Daniel had clearly pinpointed how many years would transpire before the Messiah would appear. He had not implied anywhere in his book that the Messiah's arrival would be connected with the appearance of a star or some brilliance in the sky. This they knew from the prophecy of the Gentile astrologer Balaam. Knowing Balaam's prophecy plus Daniel's timetable, they knew when to look. When they saw this unusual brilliance in the sky, they took it to be the signal that the Messiah was born. The source was divine revelation and the written record of the book of Daniel, and not astrology. In summary, we can say that Balaam connected the star with the kingship of the Messiah, while Daniel provided the messianic timetable. But why Jerusalem? Although the wise men had the book of Daniel, they did not have the book of Micah, containing a passage which the rabbis understood to be messianic. As Edersheim notes, quote, "The well-known passage of Micah 5:2 is admittedly messianic. So in the Targum and later by rabbis, it was Micah who prophesied that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. The Magi did not know that, neither did Herod the Great. So, when the wise men came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews?" Herod gathered together all the chief priests and scribes in Matthew chapter 2, verse 4, and inquired of them where the Messiah would be born. And their answer was in Matthew chapter 2, verse 5, in Bethlehem of Judah. Remember, I mentioned earlier there were two Bethlehems. There's a Bethlehem in Galilee, one of the cities allotted to Zebulun in the book of Joshua. And that's in Joshua chapter 19, verse 15. This site is not to be confused with the Bethlehem of Judah. Bethlehem was only a small village in the tribal territory and allotted to Judah. So these Gentile astrologers thought the logical place for the King of the Jews to be born would be the capital of Israel, Jerusalem. Their question about the Messiah created such a stir that Herod called these men into his own palace. In Matthew 2:7 points out that Herod did so privately and, quote, learned of them exactly what time the star appeared. Herod wanted to know how long it had been since that star first appeared. Herod determined to kill all Hebrew boys 2 years of age and younger. The star first appeared 2 years before they arrived in Jerusalem. A commentator, James Dunn, comments that while the wise men's reaction was positive, the reaction in Jerusalem was much more negative. Matthew 2, chapter 2, verse 3, he notes that, quote, Herod was troubled and all Jerusalem with him. These chief priests and scribes will become Jesus' chief opponents. And scribes will become Jesus' chief, as I said, opponents. They perceived him who had been introduced to them as the King of the Jews, and as Messiah, they perceived him as a threat. Because there were many houses in Bethlehem and many 2-year-old boys, it would be very difficult to find this child. Do they go house to house? At this point, the star they had seen earlier reappears, and it came down and hovered over where the young child was. And now it moves north to south. According to Matthew 2:11, the family was no longer in the cave or stable, but in a private house. When the wise men came into the house and worshiped the young child, this was the first Gentile worship of the Messianic person. Both the first Jewish worship, the shepherds, and then the first Gentile worship was facilitated by means of the Shekinah glory. And now we'll talk a little bit about the gifts. The gifts that the wise men gave to baby Jesus were symbolic. Gold is the symbol of kingship. Frankincense, the symbol of deity. And myrrh is the symbol of death and sacrifice. And God warned these wise men in a dream not to go back to Herod. So after worshiping the Messiah, they returned to their homeland by another route. And we're going to end right here. Next, we'll speak about the time of Jesus in Egypt and later in Nazareth. Thank you. Have a great day, and God bless you.